It's unacceptable. British troops will be direct target for our missiles.
And we are kind of ready to meet your new high technology weapon on Ukrainian battlefield.
British troops will be direct targets for our missiles. In the next 10 minutes, I'll break down the 5 most dangerous statements made by Russian MP Ivany Popov in his shocking televised warning to Keir Starmer, and explain why nuclear experts are calling this a critical turning point in East-West relations. You'll see exactly how Popov systematically dismantled Britain's Ukraine policy, why he believes NATO expansion justifies Russia's actions, and most importantly, what this confrontation means for the possibility of a wider European conflict. The final revelation about Russia's red lines might explain why Western leaders suddenly seem so nervous. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now, back to the video. When Russian MP Evgeny Popov threatened to kill you all on British television, it wasn't just an emotional outburst or momentary slip. It was a calculated message delivered with chilling clarity. The exchange began innocuously enough on Piers Morgan's show, with the host pressing Popov about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But when the conversation turned to nuclear weapons, Popov's demeanor shifted noticeably. "If you use nuclear weapons against us, we will kill you all," Popov stated flatly, his eyes locked on the camera. The interviewer's visible shock didn't deter him. Rather than backtracking or softening his position, Popov doubled down, explaining that his warning reflected official Russian military doctrine, not personal opinion.
Give me a second if you're giving me that floor, because you don't want to hear us. You don't understand Russians.
We should get independent information, but I can tell you again, we not attacking civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
This wasn't random saber rattling. Popov's threat came just days after French President Emmanuel Macron publicly discussed extending a nuclear umbrella over European allies and following UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's announcement of increased military support for Ukraine. The timing reveals Moscow's growing concern over Western involvement in what they consider their sphere of influence. Throughout the interview, Popov repeatedly emphasized what Russians view as a profound betrayal by NATO. "You promised not to expand eastward after the Soviet Union collapsed," he asserted, referencing discussions between Western leaders and Mikhail Gorbachev in the early 1990s. While Western historians often dispute whether formal guarantees were made, the Russian perception of broken promises forms a cornerstone of their grievance narrative. For Russians like Popov, NATO's expansion represents an existential threat. "We have watched American missiles creep closer to our borders for 30 years, he explained. "How would Americans feel if Russian missiles were stationed in Mexico or Canada?" This comparison, while simplistic, reveals the psychological underpinning of Russia's defensive posture. The MP's justification for the invasion struck a particularly disturbing chord. Rather than acknowledging it as an act of aggression, he framed it as protection for Russian speakers in Ukraine's eastern regions. For 8 years, the Kyiv government bombed Russian civilians in Donbass while the West remained silent, Popov claimed, recycling a narrative that has been central to Russian propaganda, despite contradicting independent reporting. When pressed on civilian casualties caused by Russian forces, Popov pivoted to accusations against the UK specifically.
as well as he knows World War II history, it will be a long and difficult dialogue with him.
Closer and closer to our borders, and Ukraine is a direct threat to our security.
Your Prime Minister Starmer sends Storm Shadow missiles that hit apartment buildings in Donetsk, he charged, claiming that Western weapons are primarily responsible for civilian suffering. This attempt to shift moral responsibility reflects Russia's broader information strategy, painting themselves as reluctant defenders rather than aggressors. Perhaps most revealing was Popov's dismissal of Western economic pressure. When reminded of Russia's economic isolation, he scoffed. "Your sanctions have failed completely. We trade more with China, India, and the global south than ever before," he claimed, adding that Russian citizens understand temporary hardships are the price of independence from Western control. Whether accurate or not, this confidence suggests Russia believes it can withstand prolonged conflict. The interview reached its most alarming point when discussing potential peace negotiations. Popov systematically rejected every Western proposal, from limited territorial compromises to international security guarantees. Instead, he outlined Russia's non-negotiable demands: Ukraine's permanent neutrality, Western recognition of annexed territories, and the lifting of all sanctions. Russia will accept nothing less than complete security guarantees on our terms, he stated firmly. The longer the West prolongs this conflict, the more territory Ukraine will lose.
We have stable economy situation. You can see on our markets, they are rising today, and yesterday they rose.
In Russia, if you will send long-range missiles to Ukraine, they gonna use it.
This take-it-or-leave-it approach reveals little room for diplomatic compromise, a concerning reality as the conflict enters its third year. But it was Popov's explicit warning about British troops that delivered the interview's most dangerous message. Looking directly at the camera, he stated, "If even one British soldier sets foot in Ukraine as a so-called peacekeeper, they will become a direct target for our missiles. This is not a threat. It is military reality." The clinical delivery made the warning all the more disturbing, suggesting Russia has already game-planned scenarios involving direct confrontation with NATO forces. Most Western analysts have long assumed certain unspoken rules of engagement exist between nuclear powers, safeguards that prevent direct military confrontation. Popov's statements suggest these assumptions may be dangerously outdated. Russia appears willing to risk escalation in ways previously thought unimaginable, raising the stakes of every Western decision regarding Ukraine. What we're witnessing goes far beyond mere political posturing. This confrontation between Russia and Britain represents a dangerous game of nuclear brinkmanship that threatens to spiral out of control. As Starmer prepares for his weekend meeting with President Zelensky, the stakes couldn't be higher. Their discussions about security guarantees and Britain's commitment to increase defense spending to 2.5% by 2027 will now take place in the shadow of Popov's explicit threats.
We're not aggressor. We are defending our land, defending our people, defending Russian language, defending Russian culture, defending Russian state.
All people in Russia are against the war, but now we can negotiate with Ukrainian people.
The fundamental question hanging over this diplomatic tightrope walk is clear. How can Britain strengthen Ukraine's position without triggering a direct NATO-Russia confrontation? Moscow has now drawn its line in the sand with unmistakable clarity. Any British military presence in Ukraine even under the guise of peacekeeping, would cross a threshold that Russia considers worthy of military response. This diplomatic crisis exposes the dangerous gap between Western aspirations for Ukraine and the nuclear reality that constrains those ambitions. Starmer now faces an impossible balancing act, delivering meaningful security guarantees to Zelensky while navigating Putin's increasingly aggressive red lines.